Hey, welcome back. Hope you had a refreshing and recharging meal. Hope you had great conversations at your tables and that you either found avenues of conversation that felt meaningful and significant to you, or that you were able to use Paloma's prompts to get you where you wanted to be in terms of connecting with folks. Quick reminder, or maybe you didn't see it yet, in the middle of your program book, there's 2 blank pages called Connections and Collaborations. That's for you to jot down names of folks you're meeting, where they work, and ideally, from my perspective as a dreamer, we're jotting down ideas of like, how might I work with this person? How might we collaborate on something creative? How might I include this person in the circle of my influence and impact this week, this month, this quarter, this year? I think we miss something when we come into gathering spaces and convening spaces and don't walk out with new creative ideas based on new relationships, right? The content is great, but content without connection is far less powerful, right? When we marry great ideas to people who can help us actualize them, that's where our power is. So I hope that you're doing that. You got a few pages in your program book to help you do that. We're going to welcome our second panel to the stage. This panel is comprised of a variety of leading experts in their fields, all with a specific perspective to them and experience around our topic, policy and justice. This panel is going to be somewhat of an interpretive conversation. What do we do with the idea that policy and decision-making across a city should benefit all, but sometimes doesn't? What does policy and action look like, and where does justice happen, and where doesn't it? And how do we move our shared communities forward in light of all this? As before, we'll let each of the panelists introduce themselves, but I wanted to say a quick word about our fearless moderator, Dr. Trevor Brown, though he's allowed me to call him Trevor today. All you have to call him Dr. Brown. No, that's probably not true. You can call him Trevor. I was only special for a moment. He's the dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at The Ohio State University, and I'll let him articulate more specifically what his work looks like from his perspective, but I wanted to note that though his awards and accolades and appointments are way too numerous to mention from the stage, that he just won Ohio State's Community Engaged Champion Award, which recognizes, university leaders who've made significant impacts on communities across Ohio, the nation, and the world. We are honored to have Trevor guiding us through this important conversation today. Welcome, Trevor, and the rest of our panelists to the stage, please.
Thanks. Okay, folks, come join me. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you all. Lovely, wonderful energy in this room. Hopefully that continues throughout the day, and lunch doesn't put you to sleep. Our job is to wake you up. As you heard, we're going to have a conversation about policy and justice. And I'm going to spend a few minutes just framing it here at the outset, and then I'm going to introduce my friends and colleagues here to my left as they get comfy on the couch. So you heard I'm the dean of the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, just up the road at Ohio State University. And one of our principal jobs at the Glenn College is to train, develop, educate, and prepare leaders and public servants to go out and do good in the world. And we aspire to imbue them with a set of values. Now, most people come with their own set of values, but there's a core set of values that we try to cultivate among our students and ultimately our graduates. And one of those is equity and justice, which we define as believing that everyone deserves dignity and respect. But different people have different conceptions of what that lofty term means. And so one of the things we're going to do over the next 50 minutes or so is start by giving voice to what that means to the different participants on the panel here. Just what does that lofty term mean? But then ultimately what we want to do is try and get concrete and operationalize it, and hence the focus on policy. We will expand a little bit that conversation around policy to include the implementation of that policy as well in some circumstances. And we have a really engaged and diverse group of folks up here who I think will give you sort of different vantage points on, again, both what that concept and construct means to them, but also then how we put it into practice. So With me here, immediately to my left, is Councilmember Nicholas Bankston, recent member of the Columbus City Council, and also President and CEO of Gladden House, a settlement house in Franklinton, just near the west side here of Columbus. Just to his left is Lori Keating, who's the executive director of the Ohio State Bar Foundation. And it was an education for me because it's an easy mistake to then think this is the Bar Association, which is a different organization, but related. And I think Lori will spend a little bit of time talking about that. But the Ohio State Bar Foundation is the charitable affiliate of the Ohio State Bar Association. And it works to improve our system of justice by supporting nonprofits who do important work in this space. And then finally, just to her left is Chief Elaine Bryant, Columbus's chief of police, who previously served for 2 decades in the city of Detroit's police force before coming south to help us in our city. So what you have on the stage then are someone who's involved in the policy design process, somebody who's in the council member, who's involved with other city officials in crafting policy, but then also holding the implementers of that policy accountable in their role representing the communities that they serve. And then in Chief Bryant, you have a policy implementer, primarily, someone who is charged with carrying out policy in service to justice. But as many of us know, I'm sure in this room, that the act of implementation is also the act of setting policy. There's a lot that we do in our organizations, the steps we take, the rules, the practices, the protocols we put into play is part of what makes policy manifest. And then finally, in Lori, we have a policy supporter and investor, not an advocate in the legal sense, but a champion in the sense that there are causes that are important and organizations that are pursuing those causes, and her organization is poised to help support those organizations in their pursuit of justice. So again, you can see already you have 3 different vantage points here. So to start, I'm going to turn to my panel and ask, how do you define justice for you? And what does justice look like from your vantage point as a city council member, as a police chief, as an executive director of a nonprofit organization? So, Councilmember Bankston, I'll start with you.
All right, well, thank you for having me. I clearly sat in the wrong part of this couch. I should have sat further down so I wouldn't have to go first.
You were first on my list already, don't worry.
But yeah, happy to be here. And justice, I think for me and the work that we do is similar to what you said. It is about everyone being treated equally under the law. But when I really look more into it, I think one of the things that I always go to, right, we always go to Webster's dictionary. How does Webster define this? And actually it's definition number 3 that stood out to me and really got my wheels turning. And it says conformity to truth, fact, or reason. And I start there to say, because in order for us, justice is something that we deliver, right? But in order to deliver it, we both, all as a community, have to start with a common understanding of what is true, what is factual, and what is of reason. And so every day, that's what I wrestle with when we come up with policies. And as we dismantle injustices, and some of the things that we see are because that there is not a common understanding or shared history of some of the things that transpired in our community. When we think of things like redlining, which I'm sure we'll get more into, when we think about injustices in economic policy, environmental justice, right? There are different forms of justice that take place every single day. But in order for us to adequately address them, we must first start with a foundational truth that we all have and hold in common, a history, right, that we all hold in common, facts and reason that lead us to that. And so that is what the lens at how I look at policy, and we're thinking about it at City Council.
Great, thank you. Director Keating?
Well, I hate to say this, but that's exactly how I was going to start my remarks.
You too
I
picked
looked
the
up
third
the
definition of
definition
I actually
and
sat
thought
in the right
exact
seat
Same thing. So, it's so nice to be here. This is a wonderful group. I really think justice is the way we as a society live together respectfully. And for that system to work, first of all, the public Everybody involved in society needs to understand the laws and how they work and how they pertain to them. So that's number one. And a big part of our mission at the Ohio State Bar Foundation is to educate the public about the rule of law. And then secondly, it needs to be accessible to all people. And we all know that unfortunately in this country, there still is a link between your wealth and your access to justice. And so that's something that we do. We support nonprofits that help those folks and give them the access to the justice that they need. And then finally, it just needs to be respectful of all people, regardless of race or gender or sexual preference or anything. And they say justice is blind, but it's clearly not when you look at society and how the system works. And that's why we at the Ohio State Bar Foundation do the work that we do.
Great, thank you. Chief Bryant.
Well, I guess I can go home, huh? No, to echo their words, everything they said, but I want to add my spin on it from a law enforcement perspective. For me, when we talk about justice, it's two-pronged. We also want to talk about the justice that we seek for making sure that we're holding people accountable for the crimes that they may be committing against people. That's procedural, restorative, and retribution. But we also want to talk about the justice to make sure that officers are upholding the oath that they promised to take to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do in the community in which they serve. So justice for me is two-pronged. I'm looking at the accountability to make sure that people are getting the justice that they deserve when crimes are committed, and that people are getting the help that they need when they're committing these crimes to be able to, if they're allowed to go back into society, be productive citizens, but also making sure that our officers are doing what they promised to do when they came on this job. One of the lines that stand out to me in our oath is that we will keep our private lives unsullied as an example to all and behave in a manner that does not bring discredit to me or my agency. So I think that it's extremely important that we live our lives that way.
And I just want to say something that, Lori said it, and we hear it all the time, justice is blind. I just want to make sure that we go back to that conformity piece. If justice is blind, then there's no way it can conform to truth, right? It can be blind to facts. It can be blind to reason. And so we have to understand that this idea that, yes, justice is for all and it's equally disputed and it should be, it can't be blind to our history. It can't be blind to our past. It can't be blind to the pain and the injustices that came before it. And so I think when we think about justice and how we deliver it in a legal standpoint from a courtroom, this is why there's this link between our wealth and how justice, and if you receive justice or not. Because if you can hire a lawyer that's good enough to spin and manipulate the law and manipulate the facts, then you're able to probably get off of a crime, i.e. January 6th, but am I allowed to say that? But it's
I don't have a mute button.
It is that we have to be careful of when we say being blind, because when we're blind to the underlying injustices or the underlying inequities that we see every single day that folks enter into the justice system, is when we continue to see this compounding of disproportionate impact that is had on minority communities, low-income communities, and folks that we fight for every single day at City Hall.
So you just started to answer my second question, so I'll come back to you at the end, and we'll go the reverse direction, since you've done a great job of presaging it, which is just to, given your well-articulated, all three of you did a great job of defining what justice means to you and your organization. Now I'm going to ask you to assess how you think we as a community are doing. Are we ahead? Are we behind? And in what ways? And you began to lay that out. Now, Chief Bryant, your community is here in the city of Columbus. Lori, I know you're spanning the state, so interpret that how you will. But how do you think we are doing in relation to your vision of justice?
Well, I'm new to Columbus, so I've been here a year and maybe 3 months. I think that we have work to do, but I also think that we have come a long way just in knowing what I know from the year that I've been here and reading the history behind some of the things that have occurred and some of the policies that have been implemented and some of the things that the city has done to try to make sure that they're addressing some of those issues. So I think that we're well on our way to being a better city, to making sure that we are getting the justice that we deserve for our residents, for our community, for our business owners, for the police department, but we definitely have work to do.
Okay. Ori?
I think we're doing a fair job. We have a long way to go, as the chief stated. I think that even bigger than Ohio, just almost every state in the nation is struggling with the justice system being fair and equitable now. And part of that is it's underfunded, quite frankly. Lawyers go to law school because they want to help people and better the community. By and large, it's not because they want to make money, but by and large, that's the reason. And when they get out and they become a public defender, or even in some cases a prosecutor in a county, a small rural county in Ohio, their caseload is usually such as they don't get to know each defendant as well as they thought they would. They don't get a trial for each defendant that they think is probably innocent. They take plea deals to keep this all rolling around. And if you have hundreds of cases that you're assigned to, the individual attention you can give to your client is really limited. And then on top of that, I think it was the first panel that said we need to spend more dollars on getting the best and the brightest in government. And that certainly applies to the courts as well. Very well qualified people get lured away from government work because corporations and businesses can pay so much more. And that affects the quality of judges we have sometimes. And I think that's something we need to work on too. What I love about Columbus, and I think how we're a little ahead of the game, is just that this is a relatively new city. I mean, I moved here 15 years ago, but I know people who lived here 20, 30, 40 years ago. And, you know, they say this was basically farmland. You know, there was the city downtown with the state house, and everything else was farmland. So we have built up in a very quick pace. And so many people are coming to Columbus from different parts of Ohio, from different states in the country, from different countries to here. Because we have a youthful population, a creative population, a dynamic population. And I think because we are diverse in more ways than some cities are, I think that gives us a fighting chance to make the improvements that we need to make.
Great.
You know, I think here in Columbus, but every community, there's work to do, right? I wouldn't say necessarily behind, but if we want to phrase it from a behind, doing great, or whatever in between, then yeah, we're behind. And every community will always be behind. Mm-hmm. And I say that for this reason, because I want to make sure that they're connected. Justice is a journey, not a destination. There is no end to it. As soon as we figure out one thing that we thought we had fixed, there's some unintended consequence. Once we uncover one thing, there's something else that we have to then fix. We should always be pursuing justice. We should always be pursuing equity and equality. That is an ongoing thing. So if any community has arrived and said that they have figured this out, they lying to you. Mm-hmm. And you don't want to be in that community, trust me. And I don't want to be in a community where everyone is just, you know, we are blindly walking around and don't think that there's more work that has to be done. There should always be work that has to be done. Because if we do get it to a place where a community that everything is great, I'm going to be out of a job and I'm not going to know what to do with myself. No, but I say that jokingly, but I say that justice, again, is a journey, not a destination, not an endpoint. It is something that is always ongoing.
So we're going to go back and forth. So what are some of the things that in your organization, in your case, it's the city council, is doing to advance your vision of justice? And sort of be specific. What are some specific areas that are of importance to you that you're working on, and what are some of those initiatives?
Yeah, a really big one, and I have to give credit to our leader, Council President Shannon Hardin, who set forth this vision of reimagining public safety. And one of the very specific things that we have done is our right response team. And this is when you call 911, instead of automatically dispatching an officer, there are folks that are on the call that are social workers, seeing if there is, in fact, an officer needs to be dispatched, or if this is a mental health crisis, or a social worker or something of that nature needs to go, so that the right response is going out. That is so critically important because, one, it frees up our resources with our police department so that they can focus on real crime and high priority crime. But then also what it does is that individual who may be having a mental health crisis or maybe having some social issue is now not interacting with the justice system, which could turn their lives upside down, right? You think about a traffic stop sometimes, and we pay our ticket and we go about our day. But there are some folks that is going to be the determination of whether they're going to be able to keep the job that they have, whether they're going to be able to pay their light bill versus this ticket, and how they engage with the justice system. So as many times as we can put roadblocks, if you will, in the way of them having to get to the courtroom or having to deal with our officers and give them the resources and give them the opportunities that they need, that is what justice looks like. And so we're really excited about the results that we've seen out of that program. It was a pilot. We are looking to make sure that we fund that fully and that becomes a standard practice across our city. So reimagining public safety in that safety is not just simply about law enforcement. It's not simply about policing our way. It is about the environmental and the social determinants of health that we have to address. And that's what we're doing, and I'm really excited about how we're reimagining not only public safety, but reimagining policy in general at City Hall.
Great.
Well, for the most part, because we're a foundation, we are not usually the boots on the ground. So we give to nonprofits throughout the state. So whether it's the Ohio Innocence Project or the Center for Holocaust and Humanity, or Disability Rights Ohio, I think had something to do with what you were explaining with that response system. We give grants to those people that are doing the hard work, that have the closest connections to their community to make the real improvements. In addition to that, though, we are an honorarium of attorneys. We're the only statewide honorarium of attorneys here in Ohio. And we have a fellows program, and that program consists of attorneys who they have proven that they practice with a high standard of professionalism, and they give back to their communities. They have a history of volunteerism. And every year we induct a new class of fellows, and that class picks something. They look at what's going on in Ohio. There's many, many legal issues to choose from, and they pick one to address in some way. So we've had fellows go into classrooms and teach constitutional law to students, or talk about how your legal rights suddenly change and your responsibilities change when you turn 18. Or more recently, we put together a Unity Summit, LGBTQ plus issues, law and policy, and we had that at the State House, and that was really well attended by the public, and explored some really important questions there about the laws and how they are right now and how they might change and what that means to individuals. So we do it both ways. We do some boots on the ground, but the majority of the work, because we give about $1 million a year, goes to the nonprofits across the state.
Chief Bryant, unless that calls for you, I'm gonna ask you the same question. It could be. There are lots of things going on in the police department, but what are some that you'd like to highlight that again align with your vision of justice and how you're advancing that in the police department?
So, two of the things that I focused on when I first got here that were extremely important. One was to decrease violent crime, and the second one was to increase community interaction and community relationships between the police department and our residents. I think that working on those together collectively have been instrumental in doing just that. We've been able to drive our crime down. We are 60 less homicides than we were last year, 17 less homicides than we were the year before that. We have 241 less felonious assault victims than we did. We've solved 84 homicides this year. So the work that we've been doing and the processes that we put in place to be able to do that, we've been doing a lot of internal changes that you don't necessarily see. I always make the analogy of like when you renovate a house and you fix all the wiring and the electrical, you don't see it, but it's very necessary for the efficiency of the house. We're doing a lot of internal changes to make sure that our processes are good and making sure that our detectives are on point and they have the training that they need to be able to close the cases and do the things they need to do. But we also work hand in hand with our residents because it's extremely important that that relationship is intact. They have been so instrumental in helping us solve cases. We've gotten over 2,100 Crime Stopper tips. We have residents that speak up daily, hey, I know where this person is, and that didn't happen because we asked. That happened because of the relationships that we've been building in the community and creating what we call police legitimacy. Because if people don't believe that you're gonna do anything about it or they don't believe in you, they're not gonna talk to you, they're not gonna care. So I think that building those relationships, that community interaction, and something as simple as, and people laugh, but the uniform change. A lot of people go, okay, you changed the uniform, but it changed the mindset. It changed the thought process and how people feel in the interaction with police. I have people telling me all the time, officers, they just look friendlier. The baseball caps versus the white leather hats. The blue shirts versus the white shirts. Them being able to not have to cover their tattoos. That was all part of the community relations and community interaction. We have young people walking up to officers saying, hey, that's a cool tat, where you get that from? That dialogue. Now they're having a positive experience with a police officer versus just meeting them on a call for service. We have officers do things all the time that people don't know anything about. A group of officers bought a group of teenagers pizzas in the park one night because they were hungry and didn't have any money. It's not something they're looking for accolades for. That's just something that they wanted to do. But having that relationship with the community, figuring out how to improve our processes as far as addressing crime and making sure that we're making those arrests that we need to make, I think are all part of that. But also making sure that we're listening, that we are providing that equity that everyone deserves when it comes to any crime or any situation. And the most important part is providing that dignity. No matter what you did, no matter what you've done, dignity. I want people to treat everyone that they run across as if it was their mother, their sister, their brother, their aunt, their uncle. If you do that, you can't go wrong. If you have to arrest them, you explain to them what's going on. There's no reason to be disrespectful. So I think just having that culture change and being able to have that environment and having people feel comfortable with officers. And I think the biggest testament is we were somewhere and a little girl ran up to a police car and she said, I want to take a picture with a police officer. And the mom said, that has never happened. Like, nobody ever wants to take pictures with police officers anymore. So that alone just tells me that we're moving in the right direction.
So, well-deserved applause. Just a quick follow-up. So you just nicely described how the community feels about these changes. How do the officers feel about these changes?
That's important. So I will tell you, even with the uniform change, I would love to take all the credit for that, but I don't do anything in a silo. That was a pilot program prior to us getting here. The officers voted on it. I think it's real important that they have a voice in the changes because if they have that buy-in, they're more likely to be happy about it, to be more responsive to it. So we don't make decisions in a bubble. We have advisory boards with the officers, with the supervisors. They have the ability to come in and tell us what's going on, the changes they think that should happen. And I will tell you, from our perspective, morale has definitely increased. And we can tell because productivity has increased. The officers are out here, they're doing more work, they're being proactive, they're not just responding from run to run and saying, oh, well, I've done my part. We're providing more training for them, just as Councilmember Bankston talked about the crisis intervention training. All of our officers are crisis intervention trained because that's important that when they run across somebody, they may be having a crisis, we want to make sure that they have the right response, that they know how to handle that or be able to get them the right resources. So I think the officers, for the majority of the officers, they have a very positive response.
Great. Councilmember Bankston, I want to come back to you. You wear two hats up here, and I didn't prep you with this. Hopefully this doesn't catch you off guard. You also serve as the CEO and president of Gladden House, and I know you have a big celebratory event tonight. And we've sort of concentrated our conversation around justice in the traditional justice system, but it's a much broader notion, and I wonder if you'd like to feature anything from Gladden House that you think intersects with this conversation.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pieces is around housing, right? And we think about that piece of it, and I think when we were talking in our prep call about the unintended consequences of policies and what they do, and I see it play out every single day at Gladden when we talk about housing, right? So one of our housing policies as a country that was a huge failure, right, was public housing and the concentration of poverty, right? Sounds good in practice. Folks who need housing, who can't afford it, we should build housing for them to go to. Yes, that's great. But what we did and didn't think about is the economic side of it. And when we concentrate poverty in places, what we have to understand, when we think about the quality of life infrastructure and when we think about neighborhood amenities, those aren't driven necessarily by government, they're driven by business and by capital. And so when there is a neighborhood whose income as a collective on average is $12,000 a year, there are no grocery stores, there are no coffee shops, there are no dry cleaners, because private business, they do the math, they can see it. We're not gonna have as many folks coming in our doors if we build a store there. And so what that has done is in a place like Franklinton, you have seen decades of disinvestment and displacement. Now, as our community is resurging, Columbus is an opportunity city, it's a place where folks wanna be. Now that housing costs and prices are going up. And so there are folks showing up to my door, and what we do at Gladden, we do really 3 pillars of work: youth development, so we're focusing on our youngest children, preschool, after school summer programming, housing and family stabilization, that's homelessness prevention, keeping people from going into the shelter, and food instability through our food pantry, and last but not least, our senior population and senior programming that we do. So really impacting the entire family life cycle. But our biggest program is our homelessness prevention program. Last year, we were able to keep 2,000 people from going into shelter, right? And also, we were able to keep 600 people, over 600 families in their home through rental and utility assistance. But it's becoming much, much harder to get folks into housing who are either low income or don't have the resources as it once was before. And that justice shows up in the way of this, that I've been renting my place for $700 a month, and now all of a sudden the market says that my landlord can get $1,500. So the landlord changes the rent to $1,500, right? There's an injustice there. Now, the landlord is not nefarious, he's a businessman, so he's gonna get what he can get out of the place. But the injustice is now that we have a system of folks that are falling through the cracks and don't have places to live, right? I have resources to house people, but no one willing to take folks. And so that's what we see, those unintended consequences of policies and those injustices that show up. And now that person, it trickles down, right? So now that they're housing unstable, that good job that they got, they can't get to it now because they don't have a place to lay their head. Their child who was doing really good in school and forming a foundation at this school now has to move schools, right? It's a trickle effect that then shows up on the back end when our officers have to respond or when they show up in the courtroom. And so that's when I say, when we talk about justice, we have to tackle it from every single side. And it's not just at City Hall. It is partners like Gladden House and so many other nonprofit organizations, philanthropic organizations that have to be a partner in this work. Because the policy alone is just words on paper without appropriate implementation and appropriate partners to get it done.
So listen to all 3 of you. You just did a great job of both sort of laying out that all policies have unintended consequences and they impact, even though their intent may be to treat the collective good, they have disparate impacts. And then you gave a great example. Chief Bryant or Director Keating, can you think of similar kinds of instances where a well-intentioned policy had these sort of disparate impacts? And then I want to follow up with all 3 of you to ask, are there things we can do to try and prevent those things from happening before we design the policy and implement it? So you could be thinking on that one. But to the 2 of you, are there similar kinds of examples in your world that you come to mind?
Sure, I can jump in. The very first case I had when I started working as a staff attorney at the 12th District Court of Appeals was a felony voting violation, which are really rare. actually. And what happened with this gentleman was it was the application of the motor voter law. So he was an immigrant, he went to the DMV, he got his driver's license, they registered him to vote. And they used those lists when they pulled juries. So he was invited to have jury service, and he went. And one of the questions that the judge asks at the very beginning before you're qualified for service is, are you a United States citizen? And he said he was not. And he said, but I voted, which wasn't a great thing to say because then he got into trouble. And it was all well-intentioned. There was actually no dispute between the parties, the defense and the prosecution, that he had done this unknowingly, that he was breaking the law. But our voting fraud law is written in such a way that it's a strict liability statute. So you don't even have to prove intent, because in a voting fraud case, that seems like that would be a hard thing to do. So again, that was something we wanted to do to increase public engagement with our government. Everyone should vote, make it really easy for people to vote. All they have to do is go to their DMV, we sign them up, it's done. But unfortunately, in this crazy application, doing so led for him committing a felony and had serious repercussions for him in his stay here in the United States.
Chief Bryant?
You know what I'm getting ready to say. Whew. So, I think that an unintended consequence, and I understand the reason behind why we're doing what we're doing, but we got to figure out a better way to do it. Our juvenile justice system. Can we talk about it? So, I know the thought process, and I get it, that we want to make sure that we are not putting our children in a situation where they are going to prison and they're learning how to be better criminals and they're coming out. But we got to figure out a way, and this is not just a police problem, this is a community problem. We have to figure out a way to get them the help that they need, and also to protect some of the residents out here from some of the situations that are occurring. So the thought process behind allowing them to go home or to score them so that they don't stay in the system was a good process, a thought process in theory, because you do want to make sure you get them the help they need. But sometimes sending them home in the toxic environment from which they came is not the answer. So we as a community need to figure out, how do we address the issues and get them the help that they need, whether it's substance abuse, domestic violence, GED training, because it affects the entire community, not just the child that did the crime, but the person whose car was stolen, who can't get to work, the person who was walking across the street that got ran over by the speeding car, the juvenile who had his friend in the car and they smashed the car and killed two of his friends. It affects all of us. So we as a community, we have to figure out what to do with our children, because they're getting younger and younger and they are committing crimes that you can't even imagine, horrific crimes. So what are we going to do? How are we failing them? Because we all are failing them, let's be clear. When you have a 9-year-old that carjacks somebody, we're failing them. We need to figure out how we're going to get to that point. Is it creating some sort of place where they can go and get all the services they need in one-stop shop? Can they get the behavioral mental health that they may need? Can they get the counseling that they may need? And we can't stop with them because it's a holistic approach. Now we got to look at the families. Look at the single mother who working 3 jobs. That's why she's not at home, because she's trying to put food on the table. So how do we get them the help that they need? Or if it's a domestic violence situation going on in the family. So I understand why we're doing what we're doing, but we got to figure out a way to do it better, because it's not working for our children.
So, do you have a follow-up?
It dovetails into your implementation and crafting policy piece, right? What you're talking about, Chief, is, I think, a reflection of what happened maybe 10 or so years ago in funding youth programming. A policy switch that said, we want to look at data and metrics. What are your outcomes, right? not necessarily how many kids you're serving, but what is the outcomes? Which, don't get me wrong, we should absolutely have outcomes when there's public money involved or philanthropic money involved. We want to hold folks accountable. But also at the same token, we have to unapologetically invest in our youth and invest in these types of programs, right? It shouldn't always be attached to, did the person's grade increase? Because maybe I'm still working on them in their reading scores, but guess what? I kept them off the street until 9 o'clock and made their ass tired, so then they're not coming out jacking your car, right? And so we have to go back to, a balance between metrics and outcomes and data, but also making sure that we're putting resources in the hands of our grassroots organizations that are reaching kids that no one will reach. I have youth programs. I know that I'm not going to reach the Kia boys. That ain't the program for me, but there's somebody out there that can reach the Kia boys who ain't getting the resources and the funding that they need to help stop the Kia boys. So that's what we have to do. We have to make sure that we have a balanced approach to policy. And the question I think you asked was, when you're crafting policy and the implementation of it, it can't be done in silos. And too often, we have folks who, yeah, you got your big law degree and your big policy degree from wherever, and yeah, it sounds good on paper, but have you rolled with the officers? Have you talked to the nonprofit providers? That is this really going to work on the ground? So it sounds good in theory and paper, but good policy doesn't come from a textbook. Good policy doesn't come from the halls of City Hall. Good policy comes from our people in our neighborhoods and working together. And that is one of the consequences that we see.
So. Since your answer was so good, I'm gonna excuse you for hating on all the producers of these higher ed degrees, the lawyers and the
it's a balance. We need both. We need both.
I think there were lawyers involved too in that
Right.
rant.
But I'm going to actually exercise a little bit of my deanly privilege and ask you all, though, we're going to go in the weeds a little bit. So the policy making, all these problems are super complicated. They are super, super complicated, and they're multi-layered, and they're systemic. And the policy making process, as I know many of you participate in it, is super complicated, and yet it is reductionist. It prizes singling out a particular problem to grab people's attention and then welcomes a very simple solution that can be easily explained, right? Like, that's why we get the motor voter law or something that's easy to remember and say things like that. What can we do in the policymaking process to incorporate that complexity and the need to not, break things into silos? From your experience, what recommendations would you give to all of us to try and incorporate that complexity into the decision-making process?
It is making sure that all voices are at the table, as much as humanly possible, right? Not every voice is going to be able to be at the table. And let me be clear. Yes, I want folks who have degrees and have gone to college helping to craft policy.
I know.
Because there is a mechanics, right, to policy and how it actually works in the framework of things, and that is a technical piece that you need. But we have to make sure we take the time that we're explaining how we got there, talking with residents and bringing them along, right? Because they're the resident expert on the ground and how it may feel. And then I know how it gets, because sometimes you've done your research, you know this, you have all the questions, and sitting down with someone who's asking a whole bunch of questions and they're like, it gets frustrating. But you have to do that.
Yeah.
You have to. We have to make sure that we go that extra mile. And we have to have diverse voices. Also, right, this is me as a politician talking to other folks, elected officials and folks that make policy have to have folks that are counter to them at the table and hear their voice. Because someone disagrees with you politically doesn't mean that their voice should be excluded from the policymaking process, because we all lose when that happens. And so as much as possible, right, removing the politics out of the policymaking process is how we get there. And that politics is not just with elected officials or big P politics, but the politics that happens in our neighborhoods, right? There's neighborhood politics. There's politics of, I'm a nonprofit, the other nonprofit does the same thing as me. I'm going to not have them at the table as I'm coming up with this program because I need to get those resources, right? So removing the politics and putting the capital P of people first and people center to it. Because what we're talking about aren't abstract things. What we're talking about aren't just mechanics in a department somewhere. The implication is on people. They are at the center of it. So if we keep them center and make sure that there's diverse voices and contrarian voices at the table with us, we come up with a better outcome. It may be longer, it may be more frustrating, but you will then see those unintended consequences as much as possible through that process.
Director Keating, you were saying just as we were having lunch together that one of the things you're trying to do is broaden the array of organizations that you support in the same
Sure.
spirit.
Yeah, we
Lion
are.
Community House is a great place.
Have you filed the grant
I
application?
think,
'Cause
I think
don't
they're
remember
having a
seeing one.
fundraiser tonight.
You do have to apply to get the award. Yeah, we are an organization, like I said, run by lawyers. Our board is lawyers. Most of our donors are lawyers. Lawyers, as you know, tend to be a little traditional, conservative, stuffy, resistant to change, all those good things. I can say that because I'm a lawyer and I've lived it. Hierarchy is important. So, and then in foundation world, foundations are pretty traditional and hierarchical. And there is a movement in philanthropy, and this is something that I would like to do with our organization starting next year, to work towards something called trust-based philanthropy. And right now, organizations apply for funds with us. They have to spend an awful lot of time on those applications. They apply realizing that they're only going to get money that foundation agrees to apply money for, whether it's operating expenses or salaries or educational materials or what have you. So, and then you do all of this, and then it's a long, exhausting process, and then usually the grant lasts for a year, and then you have to do it all again. So trust-based philanthropy really entails forming relationships with grantees, getting to know them better. It entails giving money with less restrictions, and we're lawyers, we like restrictions, right? And it also entails giving funding for longer periods than just that year. And they've done studies on this, and they found with these kinds of changes that foundations will find that they just suddenly start funding more organizations that are minority-led. And that's something we need to do. So trust-based philanthropy is on the horizon. That's something we're trying to do. And I think you need to apply for a grant.
Chief Bryant, what is your guidance to, I'm sure you live in a world where there are simple policies that we have to apply, and yet you see all the complexity. How, on the design side, how can we do better work preventing things from happening?
I think that councilmember Bankston hit the nail on the head when he talked about breaking down these silos, because that's been a big issue. I noticed coming here in Columbus, it was a lot of, even in law enforcement, a lot of agencies weren't speaking to each other. I'm like, we should all be working collectively together, because suspects, they don't have boundaries. Somebody committed a crime in Columbus, we'll go to Grove City, we'll go to Whitehall, so I don't understand why that silo is there. So I think breaking down those silos, like you said, having all the people that need to be at the table, and when you come through that door, we're gonna ask you to leave your ego outside. Because you can't have an ego when you're trying to do this work. Nobody is more important than anybody else, and we all have to have a voice at that table. And just for a little clarification, I know I talked about the juvenile justice system, but I want to be clear. We are working to fix that. We are working with the courts, the judges, the prosecutors are at the table, the Division of Police, other agencies, the county commissioners, the NAACP, Columbus Urban League. So we are actively looking for solutions. So it's not like anybody isn't trying to fix it. The public safety director's office, the mayor's office, they are all on board with knowing that we need to figure something out. So we're all sitting at tables trying to get it done. So I don't want to make it seem like I just threw it out there and and no one is working and trying to fix it. We are. It's just going to take a lot of effort, a lot of dollars, a lot of consistency to be able to get to a point where we figure out what the solution is. And again, it didn't happen overnight, so it won't be fixed overnight. But that breaking down those silos is huge, and having everyone at the table.
So we got about 5-10 more minutes before we have to bring this good conversation to close. It's gone very, very fast. But I want to give you each the opportunity. You've got a room full of leaders and public servants here across the community. You each get one. What's one policy or approach to justice that you would ask them to champion in their world? It could be something that you're working on or something you could see that they could do in their organizations. Yeah, it's just, I'll just, so
That way
each
it
of
gives
us.
me more time to think.
Yeah, right,
Yeah.
right. Again, you've got a room full of people who are clearly committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice here. And we each in our own ways could go off and leave this room and say, well, that was a really interesting conversation. But what would be a call to action to this group to say, here's something you could be working on that would advance your vision of justice?
If I can say one thing, I was here for most of the programming today, and the first panel wasn't a panel. First presentation was on DEI, and at one point, someone said something about, DEI, sometimes people equate with niceness training, but that's really not what it's about at all. It's getting people in a room and having those difficult conversations. And it's already been said that we need to bring all kinds of voices to the table. I think we also have to, the time is here, to have the difficult conversations. And I think there's difficult conversations behind almost every policy you can think of. And I think we're at a point where maybe more and more people are open to that possibility. I think they're hard for a reason, and I think we really need trained facilitators to lead those so they can, make sure the egos are left at the door and make sure everyone at the table has a chance to speak. So, that's what I would encourage people to do, is really engage, and when you're trying to come up with a solution or a particular policy, bring all kinds of voices to the table and have that tough conversation.
Great. You've had some time to think.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a specific policy, but if I'm talking to the folks here, I would say one takeaway to take back to your organizations is intentionality. Being intentional. If it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's always an I missing, and for me, that's intentional. Because DEI, it sounds good. You can have all the great policies and trainings and things in place, but if you're not intentional about the resources that go behind it, intentional about your implementation of it, of any policy, then it gets lost. And so I would say be intentional about whatever it is that you are trying to answer. But also, I would say another thing for us that we all collectively have to think about is, when we engage in this work, what are those outcomes that we want to see, right? And then who are the other partners? So breaking down those silos, we can do that here in this room alone. So it's about intentional, what it looks like inside of our organizations, intentionality of what it looks like with partnering organizations around us, because it is a community effort at the end of the day. If we all say that we've done all the great work and we have the best company and everything is great, well, if your neighbors around you are still not there, then we as a full community haven't reached our full potential. And so that's one thing I would say, is being intentional in this work, but also being patient enough to continue to have the dialogue. I can't tell you how many folks I say when we talk about these trainings and these things like that, oh, we've been through this before, and they go into it with that mindset. But it starts with a conversation. Good policy, good change starts with a conversation. So don't ever, I think, undermine just the art of starting a dialogue with someone, right? That is so critically important. I think we rush to what's the answer, what's the solution, but we don't take the time to build the relationships. We don't take the time to have the dialogue so that we can see those unintended consequences, so we can make sure every voice is heard, so we can ensure that the end of the day, what we're trying to get done is done.
Great. Chief Bryant?
So I think that from my perspective, when we talk about what we just talked about with the juveniles, and we start talking about how we're going to implement some of these changes and how we're going to figure out what we're going to do, everyone is going to have to be a part of that. So when things start rolling out and when you start hearing about different programs, when it comes to youth services, volunteer your time, volunteer your services, agree to be a mentor. I mean, you would be surprised. It's children, they want guidance. Sometimes they're just not getting it, and they just don't have anybody to look up to. Just that 20 hours out of your month may make all the difference to a child in the world. So get involved and get involved in some of these youth programs. When we start trying to roll out and implement some of these changes in regards to how we deal with juveniles and giving them their first chance, their second chance, try to find out how you can be a part of that change and what, if you have an organization, what you can do or what your organization can do to support that. So that's all I would say.
Well, with those three inspiring words of guidance to all of us, I'll pull this to a close. And first by thanking all of you for taking time out of what I know are busy days to come be a part of important conversations and connect with each other. And thanks to Mayor Ginther's Office of Diversity and Inclusion for allowing us to be a part of that conversation. And please join me in thanking our three panelists for their contributions. Daniel, I'll thank you and hand you the microphone.
Great, thank you. You can all be excused. Thank you so much. As they're leaving, how about another show of gratitude for their participation? You know, getting busy and important people onto a stage at the same time is tough, and I'm always so grateful when it comes together, and like Trevor said, grateful that you've stuck with us on the journey. I just want to reflect something that I was thinking about when we think about policy and some of the unintended consequences or the repercussions or the unplanned disparities that fall out. That relates to all of the ways that all of us show up in the roles and responsibilities that we have and in the ways that we impact and influence the spaces through which we navigate, right? That it's not about intent. And many of us in the D&I space say this all the time. It's not about intent. It's about impact. Who cares about our intent? Only us. I'm the only one in this room that cares about my intent. I could intend to be the best MC that I could possibly be through the day, but if I don't prepare and get ready for what's coming, I'm going to come up here and not guide any kind of coherency across the conversation. At the end of the day, you don't care that I woke up this morning and said, I intend to be really good at this. You care about the impact that I had on your experience at this event. In all of the spheres of influence that we have, we are the only people that care about our own intent. No one else is privy to it anyways. Right? We care about the impact that other people have as they navigate and journey across our paths. And so whether we're making policy or whether we work in an HR space thinking about how employee engagement looks, what we're not happy with, what we want to lean out of, what we want to lean into, as we think about interacting one-on-one with people in our neighborhoods and communities, in our churches, at playgrounds, in our job sites, right? We get to park this defense of intent that often arises, right? Where as soon as this conversation becomes difficult, we rush to defend our own intent, right? Instead, we get to park that and say, well, I know my intent was good, fine, I'll just put that in my pocket, I'm okay, right? What we actually have to deal with is the impact of what actually happened. Right? And I want to reflect something that councilmember Bankston said. Justice cannot be blind. It must be willing to look hard, to not turn away, to stare down and glare down the reality of our history. We cannot change what we won't look at. That's hard. It's also exciting because the more we notice and the more we pay attention to and the more comfortable we get being uncomfortable, the more opportunity for change agency that we have. That's going to be the topic of conversation for our final panel. What does individual change agency look like? What does it mean to be a practical ally? And how can we peel back some of the layers that allyship and the narrative around what being an ally means and doesn't mean, some of the social narrative that it's taken on? How can we peel back some of those layers and think about real change, agency, and efficacy? So don't go anywhere. I'm going to give you a break, but don't go anywhere. In 10 minutes, we're going to be back on stage. We've also got presents for you, okay? When you come back to your seat, we've got a gift for you that we're going to reference during our conversation here, and then as you leave, we've got another way to say thank you for being here. So take 10 minutes, hit the restrooms if you need to, take a photo, meet with someone you haven't gotten to talk to yet, and I will see you back on this stage in 10 minutes.